The tremor in her hands should have been just another detail Lee Jun-ho ignored. Another mechanical glitch in the woman who had driven his armored sedan through the jagged streets of Los Angeles for nearly a year. But when Alice John's knuckles whitened against the leather steering wheel, vibrating with a terror she couldn't suppress, something ancient and predatory roared to life inside him. He'd ordered hits for less than the fear he saw reflected in the rearview mirror. "Pull over." His voice was deadly calm, the same chilling tone that preceded a death sentence. Alice's fingers spasmed, the car swerving slightly before she gripped the wheel with a strength born of desperation. "I'm fine, Mr. Lee. It's just the coffee." Jun-ho leaned forward from the shadows of the back seat, his sharp features catching the city lights like a blade. He watched her reflexively shrink into her seat, a small, instinctive retreat that ignited a fire in him that had nothing to do with the criminal empire he ruled with iron discipline. For the first time since taking over the syndicate, Lee Jun-ho felt a flicker of something he couldn't control. "Don't lie to me," he whispered, and the space within the car shifted irrevocably. Alice had driven Jun-ho's fortress of glass and steel for 11 months without truly occupying his world. To her, he was a silhouette of expensive cologne, the rustle of silk, and a heavy, lingering danger that made the air in the car feel pressurized. She understood the rules: drive perfectly, speak only when spoken to, and maintain total invisibility. Invisibility was Alice's armor. 26 years of navigating a world that preferred her unseen had taught her how to become a ghost behind the wheel. She timed her breathing to the hum of the engine, mastered the art of watching the world through mirrors, and ensured her presence never disturbed the silence he demanded. Today, that careful armor was cracked. She had tried to hide the shaking, gripping the wheel until her muscles ached, but the threat Silas had delivered to her doorstep that morning was a weight she couldn't steer around. Her younger brother needed his tuition paid. The debt collectors were no longer just calling, they were standing in her driveway. Alice couldn't afford a mistake. She couldn't afford to be seen. But as Jun-ho's gaze locked onto her through the mirror, she realized the ghost had finally been caught. "Pull over, Alice." The command was a low vibration, barely louder than the hum of the cooling fans, yet it sliced through the cabin with the weight of a physical blow. Alice's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her fingers were locked in a death grip on the wheel, her knuckles appearing like polished ivory against her deep brown skin. "Mr. Lee, we're 5 minutes from the terminal. Your flight." "The plane doesn't leave without my word," Jun-ho interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, becoming something primal. "But this car doesn't move another inch until you do as I say." "Oh, over." With a shaky breath, Alice guided the heavy armored sedan to the shoulder of the rain-slicked boulevard. The moment the tires crunched onto the gravel and the engine died, the silence that rushed in was suffocating. She kept her eyes fixed forward, watching the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers, afraid that if she looked at him, she would shatter. She heard the leather creak as Jun-ho unbuckled and shifted. He didn't stay in the back. He leaned into the gap between the front seats, invading her sanctuary of silent competence. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the dark ink of the dragon tattoo on his neck, pulsing with the tension in his jaw. "Look at me, Alice." She turned slowly. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were burning with a dark, possessive intensity that made her throat go dry. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from hers before he finally made contact. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly gentle as he pried her stiff fingers away from the steering wheel. As he held her hand, the tremors were undeniable, shaking both of them. "You have driven me through active crossfires without a blink. You have navigated ice and betrayal with hands of stone," he whispered, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse at her wrist. "Who did this? Who took the steadiness from the woman I trust with my life?" Alice swallowed hard, her expressive eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "It's just a personal matter, sir. I can handle it." "You are shaking like a leaf in a storm," And you tell me you can handle it? Junho's grip tightened, not to hurt, but to anchor her. In my world, silence is a death sentence. In your world, it is a burden. Give it to me. Give me the name of the man who made you forget who you are. His name is Silas, she whispered, the name tasting like copper and fear. He's coming for my brother tonight. Junho leaned back, a terrifyingly beautiful smile touching his lips, the look of a predator that had finally found its scent. Silas, he repeated, committing the name to memory. He won't be coming for anyone ever again. Drive, Alice. We aren't going to the airport. The car glided away from the shoulder, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted from a cold, professional vacuum to something thick and dangerously intimate. Alice kept her eyes on the road, yet her mind drifted back through the 11 months of her invisible service. To the world, she was a ghost in a dark green blouse. To Lee Junho, she had been a high-performance tool, as reliable and silent as the engine of the car itself. She remembered the nights she had waited for him outside dimly lit warehouses and glittering galas, watching the shadows of men with guns through her side mirrors. She had seen the blood on his cuffs and heard the chilling finality of his business deals, yet she had never flinched. Her silence was her currency. It was the only thing that kept her brother, Marcus, fed and the lights on in their small apartment. She had prided herself on being the one person in Junho's life who asked for nothing, expected nothing, and noticed everything while pretending to notice nothing at all. But the silence she had mastered was now being swallowed by the noise of her own desperation. Every time she checked the speedometer, she saw the ghost of the ledger Silas had slapped onto her kitchen table that morning. The interest on her mother's medical bills had been sold and resold until it became a mountain she couldn't climb. Silas wasn't just a collector. He was a scavenger who had realized that Alice worked for someone with deep pockets. He didn't just want the money anymore. He wanted a way into Junho's world, and he was using Marcus as the key to unlock Alice's cooperation. You're thinking about the numbers. Junho's voice drifted from the passenger seat, startling her. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at his own reflection in the window. His posture relaxed but his eyes alert. I can hear the math in your head, Alice. It sounds like a heartbreak. Alice tightened her grip, but this time the shaking was gone, replaced by a dull, aching heaviness. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I stayed quiet enough, the world would leave us alone. I didn't want your world to touch mine, Mr. Lee. I didn't want the blood to ruin the only good thing I had left. The world never leaves anyone alone, Alice, he replied softly, his gaze finally snapping to her profile. It only respects what it fears. You've spent a year protecting my back while your own was against a wall. The realization that he had been observing her, not just as a driver but as a woman, sent a shirt of heat through her. The debt felt like a physical weight, a crushing hand on her chest, but for the first time in months, she wasn't breathing the air of a ghost. She was being seen, and as terrifying as that was, it was the first time she didn't feel entirely alone in the dark. The heavy sedan didn't head toward the airport or the neon-soaked chaos of the pier. Instead, Junho directed Alice to a quiet, unassuming corner of Koreatown, where a single black door stood beneath a minimalist sign. Hanul. Park here, he commanded. And leave the keys with the valet. You're not driving for the rest of the night. Alice hesitated, her pulse still erratic. Mr. Lee, I'm in my work clothes. I should stay with the car. The car is a machine, Alice. You are a woman who hasn't eaten since yesterday morning. I can hear the hollow echo of your resolve from here. He stepped out and held the door open for her, a gesture so foreign to their dynamic that she stared at his offered hand as if it were a loaded weapon. The interior of Hanul was a sanctuary of dark wood, soft amber lighting, and the scent of charred oak and fermented spices. There were no other patrons. The staff bowed low, their movements choreographed and silent, treating Junho like a returning king. He led her not to a corner booth, but to the center table, pulling out a chair for her. Sit, he said, his voice losing its edge but none of its authority. As the small plates of banchan began to fill the table, Vibrant kimchi, seasoned spinach, and glazed lotus root. Alice felt the surreal weight of the moment. For a year, she had smelled this food on his clothes. She had sat in the cold dark of the parking lot while he dined with men who decided the fate of the city. Now, the steam from the short rib stew rose to meet her, warming her face. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her hands resting awkwardly on the linen napkin. "You don't owe me a seat at your table. You pay me to drive." Junho poured a glass of tea, the steam curling around his tattooed neck. "I pay for your time, Alice. I don't pay for your suffering. For a year, you've watched my back through a mirror. Tonight, I want to see your face without the glass between us." He picked up his chopsticks but didn't eat. His gaze locked onto her with a terrifying focus. "Silas thinks he can use you to get to me because he thinks you are a weakness. He's wrong. You are mine. And I don't let anyone touch what is mine." Alice took a tentative bite of the beef, the flavors exploding on her tongue, bringing a sudden sharp sting of tears to her eyes. It wasn't just the food. It was the sudden, overwhelming sensation of being protected. In the silence of the private restaurant, the boundary she had built between her world and his didn't just break. It dissolved. "Eat," he said softly, his eyes darkening as he watched her. "Then we talk about how we're going to end him." The sanctuary of Hanul felt like a dream that was destined to end, and the awakening came with a sharp, intrusive buzz of Alice's phone against the mahogany table. She looked down, her face draining of what little color the warm meal had restored. The caller ID didn't show a name, only a string of numbers she had memorized with a sense of impending doom. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before she could reach for it, Junho's hand moved with the speed of a striking viper, snatching the device. He didn't ask for permission. He swiped to answer and pressed the speakerphone, his face a mask of terrifying neutrality. "Alice, baby," a voice rasped through the speaker, thick with the oily confidence of a man who enjoyed the sound of his own threats. "I'm standing outside your building. Your little brother Marcus is just finishing his homework. He's got such a bright future, doesn't he? It'd be a shame if he had to drop out because his big sister forgot who she owes." Alice's breath hitched, a soft, broken sound that seemed to vibrate through Junho. She reached out blindly, but Junho caught her wrist, his grip a solid anchor in her rising sea of panic. "Silas," Junho said. He didn't shout. His voice was a low, melodic growl that made the air in the room turn cold. The line went silent for a heartbeat. "Who the hell is this? Put Alice on. You've been remarkably brave, Silas, threatening a woman and a child from the safety of a sidewalk," Junho said, leaning back, his eyes fixed on the dragon tattoo reflected in the darkened window. "But you've made a fatal error in calculation. You thought Alice was a door you could kick down to get to me. You didn't realize she is the only thing in this city I've decided to keep safe. I don't care who you are, man. I want my money or the kid gets." "You want your money," Junho interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "Then stay exactly where you are. Look at the black sedan pulling up to the curb. Don't run. If you run, you'll only die tired." Junho ended the call and stood up in one fluid motion, the elegance of a refined businessman vanishing to reveal the apex predator beneath. He looked down at Alice, who was staring at him with wide, expressive eyes that held a terrifying mix of fear and a burgeoning, desperate hope. "Stay here and finish your tea," he commanded, his thumb brushing over her knuckles one last time. "I have a debt to settle, and I don't like to be kept waiting." As he turned to leave, the ancient protector within him wasn't just roaring, it was demanding blood. Alice watched him go, the driver's seat finally empty, realizing that the man she had served in silence was about to turn her world into a battlefield, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop him. The ride to Alice's apartment complex was a blur of neon lights and high-speed silence. Junho didn't return to the back seat. He stayed in the front, his presence looming over the dashboard like a dark cloud before a storm. When they arrived, he didn't wait for the valet. He stepped out of the car with a grace that was chillingly efficient, his hand instinctively reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket. "Stay in the car, Alice," he said, his eyes never leaving the shadowed entrance of the building. "He has my brother," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she scrambled out behind him. "I can't just sit here." Junho paused, turning back just enough for her to see the sharp, lethal edge of his profile. "Then stay behind me, and do not look away. If you want to walk in my world, you must see it for what it truly is." They found Silas in the dim light of the hallway, his hand gripping the shoulder of a terrified teenage Marcus. Silas was smaller than he had sounded on the phone, a man built of nervous energy and cheap bravado, but the knife in his hand made him think he was a giant. When he saw Junho, his eyes widened, the realization of his mistake finally beginning to sink in. You're Lee Junho," Silas stammered, his grip tightening on Marcus. "I just want what's owed." "She's been holding out." Junho didn't waste words on a man who had already been judged. He moved with a speed that defied Alice's ability to track. One moment he was standing beside her. The next, he was a whirlwind of black silk and violence. There was a sickening crack as Junho's palm met Silas's jaw, followed by the clatter of the knife hitting the linoleum. Alice gasped, pulling Marcus into her arms as Silas collapsed. But Junho wasn't finished. He loomed over the fallen man, his foot pinning Silas's throat to the floor. The deadly calm had evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. He reached down, grabbing Silas by the hair and forcing him to look at the woman he had dared to threaten. "This is the language you chose," Junho whispered, the dragon tattoo on his neck appearing to writhe in the flickering hallway light. "You threatened a woman who is under my shadow. In my world, that is a debt that can only be paid in one currency." Alice watched, paralyzed, as Junho's hand tightened. She had known he was dangerous, but seeing the raw, unbridled power he wielded, the way he looked at Silas as if he were nothing more than a stain to be removed, shattered her last illusion of him as just a businessman. This was the man who had ordered executions. This was the monster who had just saved her life. "Don't," Alice whispered, her voice barely audible over Marcus's sobbing. Junho froze. He looked back at her, his knuckles stained red, his eyes dark with a hunger for retribution. For a heartbeat, she saw the monster and the man warring behind his gaze. Then slowly he stepped back, leaving Silas gasping for air. "Get him out of here," Junho commanded his men, who seemed to appear from the shadows of the stairwell. He turned back to Alice, his expression unreadable. "The debt is settled. But you, Alice, you have seen too much to ever go back to being just a driver." The silence in the elevator was no longer the professional vacuum Alice had mastered. It was heavy, suffocating, and tasted of iron. As they descended toward the lobby, Marcus stood huddled in the corner, his small frame still shaking, while Junho stood like a statue of carved obsidian, his knuckles wiped clean but his aura still radiating the heat of the hallway. When they reached the car, Alice didn't reach for the driver's side door. She stopped, her back to the vehicle, her chest heaving as she watched the city lights blur through a veil of hot, stinging tears. "I can't do this, Mr. Lee," she whispered, her voice cracking against the stillness of the midnight air. Junho paused, his hand on the door handle. He turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. "The threat is gone, Alice. Silas will never breathe your name again. Your brother is safe." "Safe?" Alice let out a jagged, hollow laugh. She gestured toward the shadows where Junho's men had disappeared with Silas. "You didn't just protect us. You broke a man in front of my brother. You brought the very thing I've been running from right to my doorstep." She looked at him, her expressive eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "I spent a year being a ghost so I wouldn't have to see this. But I saw it. I saw what you are." Junho stepped toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. "I am the man who kept you whole tonight." "And what happens tomorrow?" she shot back, her voice rising. "What happens when Silas's friends come looking? Or when your enemies realize that the woman who drives your car is someone you'd kill for?" I was invisible, Junho. I was safe because no one cared who I was. Now I'm a target. She fumbled in her pocket, pulling out the heavy leather-bound key fob for the armored sedan. Her hand shook as she held it out to him. I quit. Please, take the keys. Let me take Marcus and disappear before the blood you spilled tonight dries on our floor. Junho stared at the keys in her palm, but he didn't take them. His jaw tightened, the dragon on his neck tensing as he looked from the fob to her tear-streaked face. The ancient protector in him didn't roar this time. It grieved. You think leaving will make you invisible again? He asked, his voice a low, dangerous silk. The moment I noticed those tremors in your hands, the world stopped being indifferent to you, Alice. You're not a ghost anymore. You are mine to protect, whether you wear the uniform or not. I don't want to be yours, she lied, her voice a fragile thread. Then run, he whispered, leaning closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. But you'll find that my shadow is the only place left in this city where the light can't hurt you. He turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving her standing under the flickering street lamp, the keys still heavy in her hand and the weight of his protection crushing the life she used to know. The 4 days that followed were the longest of Alice's life. She had tried to settle back into the rhythm of the mundane, taking Marcus to school, looking for new driving gigs, and double-locking her doors until her fingers ached. But the silence of her apartment felt hollow, no longer a sanctuary but a vacuum where the memory of sandalwood and danger rushed in to fill the gaps. She had achieved the invisibility she craved, but it felt like a burial. At 2 a.m. on the 5th night, a soft rhythmic knock vibrated through the wood of her front door. Alice didn't need to look through the peephole. She knew the weight of that presence. When she opened the door, Junho stood in the dim hallway light, looking remarkably human. His tie was gone, his top button undone, and the sharp, predatory focus in his eyes had softened into something raw and weary. He didn't wait for an invitation, but he didn't push past her either. He simply leaned against the doorframe, his gaze searching her face as if he were memorizing a map. I tried to let you go, he said, his voice a low, gravelly confession that broke the stillness of the corridor. I told myself that a year of your silence was enough, that I could go back to the way things were before I noticed your hands shaking. Alice clutched the edge of the door, her heart doing a slow, painful roll in her chest. You have an empire, Junho. You have everything. I have a tomb of glass and steel, he countered, stepping into the small entryway, closing the distance until she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. For 15 years I have built a life where I am untouchable, where no one dares to look me in the eye, and where my only company is the blood on my hands. It was a perfect, frozen world. He reached out, his fingers hovering just near the soft texture of her hair before pulling back. And then you drove into it. You were the only thing that was real, Alice. The only thing that didn't smell like greed or fear. I'm just a driver, she whispered, though the lie felt thin and brittle even to her. You are the only person who makes me feel like a man instead of a monster, he said, his voice dropping to a vulnerable depth. My life is empty without the sound of your breathing in the front seat. I am the king of Los Angeles, and I am standing in a hallway at 2 in the morning begging a woman to stay, because without her, the empire is just a pile of cold stones. Alice looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the cracks in the obsidian. The danger was still there, but so was a desperate, lonely soul reaching out for the only light it had ever known. The weight of his protection was heavy, yes, but the weight of his absence was unbearable. Slowly, she reached out and rested her hand against his chest, feeling the frantic human thrum of his heart beneath the expensive silk. I'm still afraid, she admitted softly. I know, he whispered, covering her hand with his own. But you'll never be afraid alone again. The surrender wasn't a white flag. It was a bridge. When Alice leaned her forehead against Junho's chest, the invisible wall that had separated the driver's seat from the passenger throne finally crumbled. By morning, the dangerous orbit she had feared became her reality, but it was no longer a chaotic spin. It was a calculated, shared path. The fallout was swift and multifaceted. The first wave came in the form of blue and red lights flashing outside her apartment. Silas's associates had tried to weaponize the law, filing reports of assault and kidnapping to pressure Alice into retracting her story. But they had underestimated the reach of a man like Jun-ho. In a sterile interrogation room, Alice sat with her back straight, no longer the trembling woman from the car. Beside her sat Jun-ho's lead counsel, a man whose smile was as sharp as a razor. "Tell them the truth, Alice," Jun-ho had whispered to her before she went in. "The truth is that you were a victim of extortion, and I was merely a witness to your rescue." With Jun-ho's shadow looming behind the legal proceedings, the police reports were systematically dismantled. Digital trails of Silas's threats were discovered, and the case against Jun-ho's intervention vanished into the bureaucratic ether. The second wave was internal. Within the syndicate, whispers began to ripple through the ranks about the boss's fixation on a driver. Jun-ho handled the dissent with the same surgical coldness he had used on Silas. He called a meeting at Hanul, but this time Alice wasn't hiding in the car. She stood in the foyer, dressed in a sharp dark suit that matched his. Her afro styled in a halo of soft defiant power. Jun-ho addressed his lieutenants with his hand resting possessively on the small of Alice's back. "The rules have changed," he stated, his voice a low, lethal melody. "She is not a driver. She is the heart of this house. To touch her is to touch me. To disrespect her is to invite the end of your lineage." Alice felt the weight of their gazes, some curious, some resentful, but she didn't flinch. She had traded the safety of invisibility for the peril of being essential. As they walked out of the restaurant together, the night air felt different. It was still dangerous, still thick with the scent of bergamot and blood, but for the first time, she wasn't just navigating the storm for someone else. She was the eye of the storm itself. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Jun-ho asked as he opened the car door for her. Not the driver's side but the back. "I've spent a year watching you," Alice replied, meeting his intense gaze with a steady one of her own. "I think it's time I let you show me the view from your side." 3 years had passed, but the skyline of Los Angeles still looked like a sprawling map of light and shadow from the balcony of their new home. Alice leaned against the railing, no longer dressed in the dark green uniform of a servant, but in a silk gown that moved like liquid against her deep brown skin. Behind her, the penthouse was filled with the soft sounds of a life rebuilt, the low hum of the jazz she loved and the laughter of her brother Marcus, who was home for the weekend from the university Jun-ho had helped him enter. The weight of the car keys was a distant memory. Alice now ran a logistics firm that operated in the light, a company built with Jun-ho's capital but fueled entirely by her vision. She was no longer a ghost moving through the city. She was a force within it. A familiar scent, sandalwood and a hint of the crisp night air, announced his arrival before he spoke. Jun-ho stepped onto the balcony, his presence still intense but stripped of the jagged lethal edge that had once defined him. He had systematically dismantled his underworld ties, transitioning his empire into legitimate tech and real estate. The dragon tattoo on his neck was still there, a reminder of the man he had been, but his eyes were fixed on the woman who had saved him from becoming a monster. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they looked out over the glowing grid of the city. "What are you thinking about?" he whispered, his voice a warm resonance against her ear. "The mirrors," Alice said softly, leaning back into his strength. "I was thinking about how I spent a whole year watching you through a rearview mirror. I thought I knew everything about you just by looking at your reflection." Jun-ho tightened his grip, his hands steady, the same hands that had once pried hers off a trembling steering wheel. "And now I don't need the glass," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. Her expressive eyes were clear, devoid of the terror that had once haunted them. "I see you, Jun-ho. Not the boss, not the legend. Just the man who chose to see me when I was trying so hard to be invisible." "You were never invisible to me, Alice," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that still made her breath catch. "You were just the only light in a very dark room. I was just waiting for the courage to walk toward you." He kissed her then, a slow, deep seal of the contract they had signed with their hearts. In the city that had once made her feel like a phantom, Alice John was finally home. She wasn't driving anymore. She was standing exactly where she belonged, beside the man who had traded an empire just to ensure she never had to shake again. Looking out at the horizon, they didn't just see a city they influenced. They saw a future they owned together.